I see it as negligent to make an identity out of a diagnosis. I see it as like soft bigotry if it's coming from a therapist or a teacher, because with the general population, we help all kids grow and develop and learn skills. And that can be done in a respectful way that respects aspects of the disability. And so when we ignore that in autistic kids, we're giving up on them. I believe that every child is worthy of being taught skills to help make their life better. But I believe that we should try to help every child find their people, their group who accepts them, and they should learn the skills to be social with others, because when they're older, they're going to need that for their mental health.
You must be some kind of therapist.
I am some kind of therapist, and I'm about to take you on a journey through the inner wilderness. I've invited brilliant guests from all walks of life to join me as we investigate, illuminate, and inspire transformation in ourselves, intimate relationships, and the social ecosystems we are constellated in. What you are about to hear may surprise you, so hang on to your earbuds for a hefty dose of sanity in a chaotic world. I am Stephanie Wynn, a licensed marriage and family therapist, branching out and building bridges between psychology and everything else under the sun. It's my honor to have you along for the ride. Let's get started. Today, my guest is Teva Johnstone. She's a licensed clinical social worker in California, currently working exclusively as a coach and consultant for parents of autistic, spirited, and highly sensitive youth. We met on Instagram, where she has quite a large following at Neurocurious Therapist and produces great content for anyone wanting to learn about parenting of children who are neurodivergent. I'm excited to see what we get into today. Welcome, Teva.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so we have a lot of ground to cover. Before we started recording, we were talking about our mixed thoughts and feelings on the subject of diagnostic overexpansion.
Mhm.
And this is something I actually haven't gotten a chance to hear your thoughts on, really. I don't know where you stand. I'm
Mhm.
curious, as someone with such expertise in the field of autism specifically, as well as kids whose brains work differently, such as, sensory processing disorder, for instance. What do you
Mhm.
think about kind of the current common understanding in the general population about the prevalence of autism, what it means, how we should be thinking about it, how quickly we should be using that label to describe things or traits that
Mm.
people have?
Yeah. Well, I primarily see children. So my world is kind of child focused, but I am aware of some of what's happening in the adult community, mostly because I see it online. But with children, I don't think that autism is overdiagnosed. I don't think that we've reached the realm of diagnostic expansion with autism in particular, especially certain groups like girls and children of color. These two categories are underdiagnosed because they present, well, children of color, they don't present differently because of their race. It's just that they're not having the access to the evaluations, or there's stigma in the family and they don't want to get the evaluation that will lead to the diagnosis. Um, so we know that's happening in some communities, but with girls, they really present differently when they have autism. And so they are often missed. And then after the age of 6, usually, the social differences really start to become apparent, and they can be sort of picked up then if parents are mindful. And then in the teen years, we know of a lot of anxiety and depression and outbursts. And so sometimes the girls are picked up then when the other mental health issues present. So I think with kids, I don't think we're quite there with diagnostic overexpansion. I know that there's a lot of adults who are self-diagnosing online. That's kind of a different topic. I don't know if you want me to talk about that, but yeah. So I
Sure,
think
we
with
can.
kids, sure. I was just going to say with kids, I think that they're probably underdiagnosed if they don't present classically, the classic little boy with autism who's rocking in the corner, sort of. It's often the school districts, and in California, we have the regional centers that evaluate the kids. And the child really has to meet a certain threshold of presentation before they will give that diagnosis. Because once they give that diagnosis, it's funding for them that they have to provide services.
So you named a couple of barriers. So one is that
Mhm.
I'm hearing what you see as a combination of lack of services in certain non-white communities and cultural factors in those communities that create more stigma around getting accurate diagnosis and treatment. And then you
Yes.
also talk about how autism presents differently in girls. I'm
Mhm.
curious to particularly hear more about your thoughts on the latter, especially because this is something that certain parents are coming to me wondering about as well.
Mhm.
Let's go ahead and go there. A lot of people, as you know, are concerned that it is girls with autism in particular and boys, but especially girls with autism who are vulnerable to believing that they are the opposite sex or some other gender identity, and that it
Mhm.
has to do with some of those factors. So, but before getting into that, though, I really want to hear your thoughts on how does autism present differently in girls? Why
Mhm.
don't people recognize it? And how should we be learning to recognize it differently?
Sure. So it presents differently in girls in a couple of ways. The first way is that if the female child ends up needing a lot of support, like we're trying not to use levels anymore of like severity, but the reality is that there are some people that have a stronger presentation of autism and they're going to need more support. Someone might say severe autism, but that's sort of taboo now in some ways, online in particular. So the female child who's going to need a lot of support, she's picked up early because it's obvious the way she presents. But the female child who has autism or is autistic, who doesn't need a lot of support, she blends in socially more. She is more socially motivated and she can pick up social cues better. And so she starts to mask and copy her friends. Um, they describe autistic little girls as socially active but awkward, whereas the little boy might not show much interest at all in engaging socially, and the little girl is very social, can be very social. She also can be very verbal. Like hyperlexia is common, speaking very early, reading early. I know of little girls who started speaking at 6 months. They tend to be very advanced. Oftentimes they're gifted. And so that's another sort of barrier is that parents will be comfortable with the girl just having the gifted label and they will lump all the challenges and quirks under the gifted label. Um, so socially, she's a lot different. IQ tends to be higher. She can mask better, blend in better. I'm trying to think what else. She just tends to not present classically, like the classic little boy who we think of who's always stimming. She might do that less. She will pick up sooner that, like, oh, other people aren't doing this. I think I'll stop this kind of thing. Just more socially adept. Yeah.
So you brought up the term masking. Can you explain that for people who
Mhm.
haven't heard it before?
Sure. So masking, first of all, everybody masks, whether you have autism or not, everyone masks. It's basically using a different social self for different contexts, like a job interview. We're not the same as when we're just hanging out at brunch with our girlfriends, right? So at the job interview, we could think of ourselves as kind of masking a bit. Um, but autistic people mask at a much higher level than the rest of the population. And they it's like they are playing a role, a social role. So it doesn't feel authentic. It feels a bit like they're acting. And they are sort of stuffing other natural impulses, like say to stim, flap the hands, or um, look look away. So eye contact is different, but when they're masking, they might give more on eye contact. So they're disguising their autistic traits in order to fit in, be accepted, be safe, all of those things. And
So,
sorry, go on. Oh, I was just going to say, there are a few studies, I don't know the names off the top of my head, that show that long-term masking over the years and also like long periods of time every day can start to compromise mental health.
okay, so when you first described
Yeah.
masking in the sort of ordinary context that we can all understand from personal experience, I
Hmm.
really hear you talking about code switching, right?
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna show one side of myself at home with my family, people who understand my sense of humor. I can be a little unhinged, right? If I'm
Yep.
in a different context, I'm gonna put on my professional face and be a little bit more careful. Ideally, I'm
Hmm.
actually not very good at that.
I'm not either.
but
Yeah.
but everyone code switches, and if they don't, they
Hmm.
probably get into trouble, because if you act,
Hmm.
if you come from, let's say, a rough youth culture, and then you start
Hmm.
acting on your first job site the way you do with your friends,
Hmm.
you're probably not going to keep that job very long, right? So it's
Yeah.
very adaptive. We all learn to code switch, and
Hmm.
I would say most quote unquote neurotypical people code switch automatically without thinking too
Hmm.
much about it. And really,
Yeah.
what I hear in that masking, um, a lot of autistic people, as far as I'm aware, are really deliberately emulating the behavior of the people around them. They're like,
Hmm.
I'm supposed to do this with my face, right? And this with my body, and
Yeah.
it can be the same with all of their mannerisms, and that's part of why it feels so stiff and stilted, because it's like they're studying really hard.
Hmm.
So what's
Yeah.
going on in the brains, or in the thought process of autistic people when they're masking?
So what you just described, it's an attempt to like be accepted and belong and be safe, reduce the chance of bullying, reduce punishment by the teacher or the adults in charge. So they have difficulty understanding the neurotypical world of social interaction. And so when they want to belong and they want to be safe, they study the behaviors and then copy them. And it's a lot like what's it called? Method acting, right? So they're like really studying how others are out in the world and they try to be that way as well in order to belong and be safe, really. Because if they start stimming, if they won't look at people, that brings a lot of attention to themselves, and sometimes people are mean and bullies. And
I've
some
always gotten the
punishment,
sense,
yeah. I was just going to say some punishment is really cruel that they may get. Yeah.
I've always gotten the sense, and I'm not sure what all I read exactly that contributed to this, what
Mhm.
all that came from experience. It's just the impression I've gathered over time is that um, people who are autistic can essentially learn the same things as anyone else, but it like has to go through a different path in the brain,
Mhm.
is how it feels. Like the things that come naturally or intuitively to many people, things that if we were pressed to do it, we would have a hard time explaining how we do it. Um,
Mhm.
Autistic people have to study it. And when I think
Yeah.
about, the minds of some autistic people that I've gotten into, they usually have fascinating ways of organizing information.
Mhm.
Like, for
Yeah.
instance, they can actually picture a mental filing cabinet or a mental
Mhm.
house in which they store information, and they can picture themselves withdrawing information. So they have
Yeah.
this really unique way of organizing. And I remember uh, an autistic person I once knew who was very, very, very smart, um,
Mhm.
studying my body language really intensely,
Mm.
like
Yeah.
staring at me really intensely, and then saying,
Yeah.
"You moved your hand like this. Does this mean this?" Because that
Uh-huh.
was what he trained himself to learn. Like he actually
Mhm.
read books on body language to try to understand it. So it's been my observation that people with autism can actually get very good. In fact, they can get better than neurotypical people at reading certain
Mhm.
things if they study it explicitly, the same way you might study engineering.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The processing is different in autistic people. Many do need uh, visual cues for things. They do tend to learn visually. They do tend to picture the image of whatever it is you're talking about. They tend to need more sensory motor input when they are trying to learn something, say academic. And so there's really a nervous system wiring difference that needs sensory motor input or is super sensitive to sensory motor input, and it affects how they learn and act socially. Yeah.
Say more about that. What do you mean by sensory motor input?
Sure. So I'm just looking around where I am to for an example. But so sensory motor input, a child who's dysregulated will do really well often on a swing. And that is motor input that is regulating of the vestibular system, I believe. Um, another example of sensory input is like a child who likes to squish slime. Um, the child who is regulated jumping on the trampoline. The person who likes to feel soft things on their face. So anything that our sensory system experiences, tactile, visual, smell, sight, and there's also vestibular and proprioceptive that have more to do with movement. Autistic people tend to have an atypical response to these things. They're either like hypersensitive or they are hyposensitive. They can't really feel it as much. Yeah. And so
And
sensory motor input can really help people feel regulated and calm and safe in their bodies, particularly children. Adults too, but I work with kids, so yeah.
if you were to come to me as a client and tell me you were feeling grumpy, irritable, lethargic, stressed out, or unfocused, I'd want to do a thorough assessment of your lifestyle. And one of the first elements we'd look at is the quality and quantity of your sleep. You need at least a good 7 hours of refreshing sleep every night in order to be your best self. There are many things that can get in the way of that: a demanding job, a new baby, or just plain bad habits, for example. But if you're having difficulty falling or staying asleep for the simple reason that you're too hot, you're too cold, or you and your partner don't agree on the temperature, look no further. I have just the thing for you. And since this is not therapy but a podcast, I can actually sell you stuff. So I'm going to genuinely recommend that you check out the Pod Pro cover by 8 Sleep. It's the most advanced solution on the market for thermoregulation. The cover can adjust the temperature on each side of the bed individually for you and your partner based on your sleep stages, biometrics, and bedroom temperature, reacting intelligently to create the optimal sleeping environment. Personally, I have mine set to run on autopilot so that my bed is warm when I get in, cool in the middle of the night, and warm again when it's time to wake up. I sleep very soundly this way. Improving your sleep is one of the best investments you can possibly make in your overall well-being, the quality of your work, and the lives of the people you touch. So go to 8sleep.com to check out the pod and use the code SOMETherapist at checkout for up to $200 off your purchase. Even if they're already running another sale, this code will get you an additional $50 off. And to my listeners around the world, 8 Sleep currently ships not only within the USA, but also to Canada, the United Kingdom, select countries in the European Union, and Australia. All right, now back to the show. I recall a case of a child with fetal alcohol syndrome, which obviously is not the
Uh-huh.
same as autism, but it
Uh-huh.
affects the central nervous system, who
Yeah.
had that hyposensitivity. And it was a real safety hazard because when a
Mhm.
kid is hyposensitive,
Mhm.
the same amount of comfort that another kid could get out of, just kind of fidgeting with their sweater, rubbing their sweater against their skin, something
Mhm.
really innocuous, that kid would need to literally throw themselves against the walls. Like they would have
Yeah.
to inflict pain and injury coming into
Mhm.
harsh contact with physical objects in order to get that same level of sensory feedback. So in some cases this kind of problem can become quite extreme. Now, I'm curious
Mhm.
what you think. I know you don't think that there's a problem of diagnostic overexpansion with children, but I'm
Mhm.
curious when you kind of take a look at the broader culture, it's becoming very common for kids to have fidget toys. There's a whole
Yeah.
industry of fidget
Mhm.
spinners and things like that. And it seems like it's become a normal thing for all kinds of kids, not just kids with any kind of,
Mhm.
diagnosis. And
Mhm.
when I see that fidgetiness, that restlessness, I think, do we really need to be doing this? And are maybe kids' hands feeling a little itchy because they're not doing the type of tactile activities that are a natural part of the learning process? So I'm
Mhm.
thinking about how, throughout the course of human history, we've done a lot with our hands.
Mhm.
Cooking, kneading bread, making things out of clay, sewing,
Yeah.
repairing,
Yeah.
fixing, building, tearing down, gardening, planting, digging,
Mhm.
tending our domesticated plants and animals. Um,
Sure.
I'm curious, that in addition to contact with the natural world, do you
Mhm.
feel like part of the rise in this kind of culture of fidget spinners, or
Mhm.
maybe part of the rise in the rate of neurodevelopmental disorders in general, could have anything
Mhm.
to do with our modern ways of living and maybe the absence of things that should just naturally be part of life?
Mhm. That's a really excellent point to think about with the lack of tactile stimulation in normal and everyday life today, as opposed to like decades ago. I've never conceptualized it in that way, but it makes sense. I do think that there is a like sterilizing of today's modern world. And I do know that children are not getting enough stimulation outside, like you were just describing. Um, so it could be that they are looking for it in the fidget toys. I mean, that seems kind of logical, but I don't know if that has to do with the rise in neurodevelopmental disorders. I'm just not totally sure about that. But I do think that as a whole, children's mental health, including autistic and ADHD children, is suffering because of the way that we are living today, because we're spending so much time indoors, because parents are over parenting, helicopter parenting. Um, and the kids are on their screens and they're not outside and they're not barefoot and they're not climbing the trees. I think that all of that contributes to the children's mental health crisis that we're seeing today, and probably does also compromise autistic children.
And
The
what do you think?
environment is a big deal for autistic children.
I'm also curious, as somebody with this neurodevelopmental perspective that you have, what you think about the influence on the 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds of today. We're
Mhm.
recording this in the fall of 2022, of
Mhm.
you know, the past few years of masking, right? The not seeing people's faces. I mean, obviously they
Oh, yeah.
hopefully they see their family members' faces at home, but what do
Yeah.
you think it's done to children from a developmental perspective?
Oh, gosh. I cannot imagine having a young child and having them home for 2 years or only seeing masked faces for 2 years. That would absolutely affect their social emotional development because we all need to see faces. It gives us so much feedback, autistic or not, particularly young children who are not as verbal, and the way that they understand the world is visually and with the affect of what we're doing with our faces. So it's likely that it contributed to the mental health crisis that we're seeing today, although it started pre-pandemic. And being on screens, being on screens so much for learning and entertainment. I just Well, we have research that tells us that, over 2 hours a day for certain populations is very detrimental for girls. Um, but I just think that kids need to be outside. They need to be feeling the grass on their feet. They need to be, getting dirty with real dirt. They need to be doing all those things. And so I think that these past couple of years for people who stayed inside, um, it's likely that they are delayed, developmentally delayed socially.
And when it comes
Yeah.
to kids who do meet the criteria for a diagnosis of autism, we call it a neurodevelopmental disorder. So there's
Mhm.
the neurological component and the, let's say, the genetic component, right? And then there's the
Mhm.
developmental process, and things that affect the developmental process can also be genetic or inborn, but they can also be environmental. um
Mhm.
the jury's usually out on most things when it comes to
Yeah.
like how much is nature, how much is nurture. But I'm
Mhm.
curious for your perspective on well, on just that. When it comes to autism, how much is inherent and how much
Mhm.
is has to do with the social or the physical environment? um, and what do you think accounts for the rise in autism in recent decades?
Mhm. Mhm. Um, okay, so you are correct. The official jury is still out on autism. We don't know the cause. We actually do not know. We think that it's somewhat genetic. And then the other part, we don't know. We know it's something in the environment, but that could be the environment in utero as well. Mother's physical health, mother's mental health, pollution. I think there's one study that says if you live next to a freeway while you're pregnant, you're more likely to have an autistic child. So that part is still unknown in the medical field. Um, I don't have a strong opinion on what it is in the environment, except that I know that when the children are here, when they're out of the womb, and let's say the child is going to be autistic, they're wired that way. Um, if the environment is a certain way, we will see those challenging autistic traits skyrocket. And then when we change the environment, we can see those autistic traits plummet to where the child might not even meet criteria for a diagnosis, but you still know that they're autistic. It's like when the environment is ideal for an autistic child, the autistic child maintains all the things we like love about autism, because there are a lot of strengths and gifts and beautiful things about these children. And those things remain, and they're different from the rest of the population. They're definitely like autistic, but the challenges dramatically fade when the environment is ideal.
Okay, so let's
Yeah,
talk about those strengths and weaknesses
sure,
and how to shift
sure.
that balance. I do want to say
Yeah.
what you said about living next to a freeway makes sense.
Mhm.
This is not official medical advice.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at any studies when I say this, but I'm I've I'm pretty sure I've come across evidence that heavy metals
Mhm.
in the bloodstream can contribute to
Mhm.
autism, and that's why, I know there's a lot of debate, and people think that those who say vaccines cause autism are supposedly conspiracy theorists. I have not
Mhm.
done my research. I'm not going to comment on it, but my understanding of their argument is
Mhm.
that it's the heavy metals used in the vaccines that they're
Mhm.
worried about being neurotoxins, which makes sense because
Mhm.
heavy metals can be neurotoxins. That's an established
Sure.
fact. And it
Absolutely.
makes sense because the pollution in the air, I'm sure there's like lead and
Mhm.
who knows what all in the pollution from a freeway.
Yeah.
But moving on from the, physical environmental factors, you're talking about the social
Mhm.
environment and the sensory environment.
Mhm.
And so, first of all, let's talk about what are those wonderful qualities that we want to help bring out the best in these kids with. I mean, off the top of my head, autistic kids can people in general can be really smart. They can have way better memories than the rest of
Mhm.
us. Um,
Yeah.
they can also be honest. They can be
Mhm.
incredibly fair-minded because of just how
Mhm.
rational they are. It
Yeah.
might take them longer to understand something in the particular way that they need to understand it, but once they understand it, they can have a really good grasp.
Mhm.
They're really great at memorizing anything relevant to their special interests, and so in some
Mhm.
ways, depending on what industry you're in, they're kind of the perfect employee that you're going to want in certain roles. So those are just a few of the
Absolutely.
things that come to my mind when I think about what we love about autistic people. What else would you add?
Mhm. I would add large amounts of empathy towards animals and people who are disadvantaged, and just a really deep caring. It's a misconception that autistic people don't have empathy. They can actually have like more empathy than others. I would say artistic qualities. Some autistic people just have amazing giftedness in art, and from an early age. They can be hilarious. The humor can be really, what's his name? Dr. Barry Prezant. This is from him. He says that they have a subversive sense of humor. So it's, not what you want to use at the office. It's subversive and it's hysterical. And just so like deadpan sometimes. So, and then there's just like a true authenticity. You know that, first of all, everyone can lie, including autistic people. However, like you said, they tend to be more honest, and what they say oftentimes is what they mean. So there's not a lot of guessing that we have to do. So it's just things are clear. You kind of know where you stand. Um, and just like the love of movement, the joy that you see on these kids on their faces when they're moving and doing what their body needs for their central nervous system. It's just so beautiful. Yeah. Um, yeah, I would say that that's what I could think of for now.
And you said that in the right social and physical environment, you
Mhm,
see more of these strengths coming out and fewer of the weaknesses, the behavioral problems, meltdowns, and so on. So,
mhm.
what are those factors that help these kids shine?
Wow. So no two autistic people are the same. I do want to say that. But generally speaking, as a group, there are some commonalities. So autistic people, children, tend to thrive when they have a lot of autonomy, when they are not being controlled every moment of their day. I'm thinking of children right now. Um, so like some autistic kids do really well in alternative educational settings, like homeschool or what we call unschool, which the official name's like self-directed education, but just a lot of opportunity to have autonomy, a lot of opportunity to move their bodies and be unrestricted, a lot of opportunity to seek out the sensory motor input that they need to regulate. Um, and just an accepting environment where people are aware of their quirks and their differences and just accept them as they are rather than trying to fit them into some other box. And then I want to talk about like the apps, what autistic and all children need absent in their environment. They need an environment where parents are not fighting, where parents are not cruel, where parents are flexible and not rigid, where parents understand the disability and make accommodations in the house, reasonable accommodations. So they need to be around adults who are understanding of the disability, willing to make accommodations, but also challenge them appropriately.
As a therapist, I've gotten an up close and personal view at what people tend to struggle with day in and day out. Turns out it's almost universal that we know we should be taking better care of ourselves in terms of the basic building blocks of well being, like diet and exercise. But as valuable as it is for our mental and physical health to change our lifestyle habits, it's also much easier said than done. People often set goals that are too lofty, only to feel even worse about themselves when their aspirations inevitably fail. That's why I recommend starting with positive changes that are as simple as possible. Enter my new favorite beverage line. Organifi makes it so easy to improve your nutrition and start feeling better right now with refreshing plant-based blends of superfoods and adaptogens that you can just mix with water. My personal favorite is their green juice. It contains moringa, ashwagandha, chlorella, spirulina, wheatgrass, beets, turmeric, mint, lemon, and coconut water. 100% organic with no added sugar, and it tastes great. My family loves Organifi Gold, which promotes relaxation and restful sleep, served mixed with warm almond milk before bed. Organifi also makes several other powerful blends, all organic and loaded with vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, phytonutrients, anti-inflammatory herbs, and adaptogens. For less than $3 and 3 grams of sugar per serving, you can start giving your cells the support they need to manage stress and feel good. Check out their product line at Organifi.com. That's spelled Organifi.com. And use promo code SOMETherapist to get 20% off your entire order. Your whole body will thank you. All right, so you talk about the importance of the sensory motor activity in order for these kids to stay emotionally regulated. And what came to mind for me was picturing the autistic, maybe not diagnosed, distressed 14-year-old girl sitting around in her room on TikTok and Tumblr all day. So I'm curious what happens to these kids when they don't move enough? Because I'm gonna guess that there are a lot of autistic kids or semi-autistic, somewhere in that broader autism phenotype, who really aren't getting enough movement. Maybe they had it conditioned out of them. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that any child who is not getting enough movement is going to have issues. And I think that the general way that we're living, where kids are on social media so much of their day, particularly little girls. So the autistic teen who's on TikTok and not moving, I think that that would probably compromise her mental health. Also, what we get concerned about with being on social media for so many hours is what the child is not doing socially in the real world. So, if that's taking away from the autistic child's social experiences out in the world, that is really a problem. And then, social media is wild. It's hard for adults. Imagine how it is for a 14-year-old girl? I mean, remember what it was like to be a 14-year-old girl? Gosh, it's so confusing and people are catty and you just yeah, you want to fit in. So social media is just going to amplify all of that. And yeah, if she's not getting movement, if she's not socializing out in the world, if she's engaging in online behavior that can make her a target of like cancel culture, right? So people might mob on. They do this with teens. The autistic child is really going to be affected by that. Mhm,
Earlier, you were talking about masking,
mhm,
and I'm thinking about okay, so a kid who's already predisposed to learn how to behave through mimicking other people rather than
mhm,
naturally absorbing healthy code switching behaviors from their
mhm,
environment. The kid who is masking in that stereotypically autistic way, if most of their social input is coming through, let's say TikTok, where that's where they're getting people's mannerisms, then what they're going to be mimicking in their masking is really exaggerated, dramatic,
yeah,
inappropriate behavior. I did
yeah.
I'm not big on Instagram. I mostly write on Twitter, but I do remember I made an Instagram series on histrionic personality disorder
Oh,
and
uh-huh.
how, we people love to talk about borderline personality disorder. They love to talk about narcissistic. Well, the other one in that triad of cluster B personality disorders is histrionic. Actually, antisocial's in there too. They're all
Mhm.
interpersonally exploitative in some way or another. But,
Yeah,
histrionics, uh, I think that we don't talk about it enough, not necessarily because we need to be diagnosing strangers on the internet with a personality disorder. That's not what this is
yeah.
about. But to
Mhm,
be able to recognize the traits of maladaptive, inappropriate social behaviors and what I see on TikTok when I go on TikTok, which is not often, I mean, mostly I see people, I see things from TikTok that people share on other mediums.
yeah.
And it's actually quite histrionic, which means it's really dramatized. There's a loud,
Mhm,
dramatic, superficial display of emotion without a lot of substance to it.
mhm,
And it's attention seeking and grandiose.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so then I wonder kind of how this is all playing out, because these autistic kids, diagnosed or not, they're spending a lot of time on TikTok and they're seeing this incredibly grandiose, dramatic display of emotion. And they're
mhm,
thinking that's how to be and that's how to get attention. And then they take this to their
mhm.
families or they take this to their peers. I'm just connecting the dots in this way, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, wherever you want to take
Yeah.
it.
I think that one of the risks of being on TikTok all day and being autistic and being a girl is beginning to think that you have every mental health diagnosis that the influencers are talking about, the
Yeah.
mental health influencers. Yeah. And I think that there can become a hyper focus on mental illness and what diagnoses do I have, and then kind of taking on those diagnoses, self diagnosing, and then after that, making an identity out of the diagnosis. I think that being on TikTok all day just shrinks your social brain and makes their world so small. And what happens when your world is small? You're depressed. You have no meaning. You have no joy. And then these kids, some of them self harm. Autistic youth have very high rates of co occurring mental health disorders. So combine that risk with being on TikTok all day, not being with friends out in the world, not moving your body. It's a disaster. I have
And one
strong
reason
feelings about it. I'm kind of opinionated on it.
I'm glad you're here. Let's go there because one of the reasons that I really wanted to have you on this show is because I think You do a really excellent job at modeling what it is to have curiosity, compassion, and awareness toward neurodivergent people
Mm,
without succumbing to victim rescuer dynamics.
mhm,
It's like you have this wonderful messaging about what we need to understand about autistic people, how the environment of autistic people can shift to help them. But at the same
mhm,
time, you don't put all the blame on the environment, all the responsibility on the environment. You still want autistic people to gain tools for themselves,
mhm.
and you don't think it's healthy to build a sense of identity around a diagnosis. And I agree with you
Mhm.
on that. Um,
Yeah.
so, how do you strike that balance?
It's tricky and my process is not perfect, but I try to just be honest. I'm someone who is also honest a lot. Um, and I draw from my mental health and social work training, my time as a clinician, um, and I combine that with some of the tenets of the neurodiversity movement. For me, I think that we should treat everyone with respect. Everyone is worthy of, dignity. Um, and that means we should help people grow to be their best selves and live their best lives. I see it as negligent to make an identity out of a diagnosis and then not to try to grow and work on yourself. And I see it as like soft bigotry if it's coming from a therapist or a teacher, because with the general population, we help all kids grow and develop and learn skills. And that can be done in a respectful way that respects aspects of the disability. And so when we ignore that in autistic kids, we're giving up on them. That's like a bigoted behavior to give up on them because they're disabled, because they have a disability. So, um, I just strike the balance in that I believe in my message. I believe that every child is worthy of being taught skills to help make their life better. And we have to think about kids when they're older. And we know that to have a joyful life, we have to be able to be in community with others. We have to know how to socialize with others. It doesn't have to look one way. There's flexibility there. But I believe that we should try to help every child find their people, their group who accepts them, and they should learn the skills to be social with others, because when they're older they're going to need that for their mental health.
I think
We are social animals. Yeah.
that's so well said, that we're giving up on these kids if we don't do our best to help them adapt to the world they're living in and find their place and have the skills to do that. And they'll always be different. Hopefully,
Mhm.
we can help support the most wonderful of their differences, right?
Mhm.
Without the most inconveniencing of their differences becoming a deal breaker for relationships, jobs, and things like that. I think about
Yeah.
times that, let's say, I'm working with parents who have a teenager that's behaving in a way that's out of control and abusive. And,
Mhm.
the parents think, oh, well, she's autistic, or she's this, or he's that, right? And it's
Mhm.
like, yes, and how would you feel if you knew your daughter was behaving this way at her first job? How would
Mhm.
you feel if you knew your son was treating his first girlfriend this way? You'd be very
Yeah.
worried about their future, right? So it's your
Yeah.
job at home to try to help prepare them for situations in which you want them to succeed. And that's possible. It's possible
Mhm.
to uh, cultivate your strengths and mitigate your weaknesses, even as someone who's different. It doesn't mean you have to work and think the same way as everyone else, but you can be held to certain standards of behavior. It's not gonna serve
Absolutely.
anyone for you to get a free pass to scream and cuss at people and
No,
throw things or whatever the behavior is.
no, and you won't get a free pass once you're an adult. You will not get that free pass. We don't want these kids to be unsafe if they become involved in with law enforcement. We don't want them, to not have the impulse control that that will then put them in danger. And so learning these basic skills when they're younger is vital for their future social health, mental health, and, relational health. You know, intimate relationships, close friendships, all of that. Yeah.
It seems like we're so close but so far away from having a really functional way of talking about a person's diagnosis. Like, I'm
Mhm.
thinking about the difference between I'm autistic, therefore you need to do it my way. I can't think of a more
Mhm.
specific example versus, sorry, I'm autistic. Explain it to me like I'm 5, right? Not to say that a
Yeah.
person who's autistic is mentally 5 years old. They're not. But I can think of plenty of times that I, as someone who does not have that diagnosis, have said,
Mhm.
I don't get it. Explain it to me like I'm 5. You know,
Oh,
not because I
absolutely.
have to think any less of my intelligence, but because I am not good at that particular subject, because I'm mentally
Mhm.
tired, because I
Yeah.
just need someone to make it more clear, and
Mhm.
and I think the same could be said for anything. Sorry, I'm autistic. Was that a joke? I can't tell. There's so many
Yeah.
ways, and it's not I'm sorry that I'm autistic. I apologize for my existence. I'm sorry my diagnosis
Right.
is an inconvenience to you. It's just a social
Yeah.
nicety, that you could say I'm going to take responsibility for the fact that there's something different about me that makes this
Yeah.
ordinary thing more difficult, and I'm just going to ask you for your help. And then we meet
Yeah.
in the middle, and it's not a huge sacrifice on
Absolutely.
anyone's part.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that that is a very healthy approach. It's okay to name your differences and ask for accommodations. And the accommodation is, can you explain that with a lot less wording and just like super clear? Because all those extra words are like scrambling my brain right now. Um, and yeah, so it's really important to learn what you can learn because we want to set these kids up for success. We want them to have employment. Um, and people say, in the social justice communities, especially online, they'll say employment, like, you know, F capitalism. I'm not going to participate. And it's like, do you want to be at home and depressed? It's not about capitalism. Every human being needs to work at something in order to have mental wellness. It's not about capitalism, but there can be this real black and white thinking of like good and evil, you know? And so sometimes when we talk about employment in the future, that is lumped in with the evil.
Yeah, I feel for these kids. I was right there. I was an anti-capitalist 16-year-old myself. And,
Yeah.
it all kind of comes back to the serenity prayer, right? Like
Mhm.
what can and can't you control? Setting aside any discussion of,
Mhm.
which is better, capitalism, communism, social, setting aside any of that,
Yeah.
just the practical reality of like, this is the world you're living in. You're probably not equipped to change the way all of society is structured, especially if
Mhm.
you can't even get your laundry folded. So, how
Mhm.
about we just adjust to the environment we're in and look at what we can control, right?
Yeah.
We can't control
Mhm.
that we live in a capitalist country, setting aside
Right.
discussion of whether that's a good or bad thing. What
Yeah.
we can control is what direction you choose to go with how you're
Mhm.
going to look after yourself, what interests you're going to pursue, how you're going to use money in your own life, but you're definitely going to need it, right?
Yeah.
But also it's
Yeah.
it's hard to see the future. I mean, the developing brain of any young person,
Mhm.
our ability to actually see and plan for future consequences doesn't mature until our 20s. And then add
Yeah.
some kind of neurodevelopmental disability on top of that. It's very hard to think
Mhm.
clearly. But I want to talk about differential diagnosis because you brought up an
Mhm.
important point that a lot of these autistic kids have multiple comorbidities and
Mhm.
then and real comorbidities, right?
Mhm.
But then you add to that that they're looking to self-diagnose on social media where identity gets wrapped up in it. Um,
Mhm.
and so let's talk about the differential diagnosis.
Mhm.
Particularly, I'm curious about your thoughts on the comorbidity rate between autism and obsessive compulsive disorder.
Mhm. Um, okay, where should I start? Self-diagnosis online?
Sorry, I threw
Yeah.
like three
No, that's
questions at
okay.
once, didn't I?
I know,
Wherever
that's
you want to
okay.
go.
Just the way my brain works too. I'm like, okay, which one? Where do I go?
Yeah.
Um, so let's see. Self-diagnosis online, and then making an identity out of it. I have concerns because as clinicians, we know that diagnosis is not that simple. And we are always looking at differential diagnosis. For autism in particular, you need to take a full developmental history to get the most accurate diagnosis. And I don't see that happening online with children. It's just not possible. So I worry about that. And then I worry that, maybe something else is being missed. Maybe it's not autism. So we know that autism looks like other things. Autism can look like borderline personality disorder, which we don't give to kids, but late teens, early adulthoods that we might start to see some traits. Um, it can also look like OCD, and then the diagnoses can exist together. So why does that happen? Was that your question?
Well, actually, yeah. Well, I'm curious about with OCD, but you brought up borderline personality disorder. So I'd love for
Mhm.
you to elaborate on that confluence.
Yeah. So there can be a lot of misdiagnosis. There's a thought that there's a lot of misdiagnosis that autistic adult females are misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. The two conditions look a lot alike in some people, in adults, but this is why we need a developmental history because in order to diagnose something as autism, we have to have seen the traits in early child development. We usually see them by age 3. They're toddlers. Whereas with borderline personality disorder, we're seeing that in late teens at the earliest. Um, and it's usually, we think that it's related to complex developmental relational trauma within the family. There might also be a genetic predisposition, but autistic children will have a similar presentation to borderline personality disorder without all that family trauma. And so we need to know the background. It's not, you can't just pick things off of a list. Um, And I think that the reason the two can look a lot alike is because they both struggle with emotional and physiological dysregulation. Um, they both struggle socially, but the social differences I think are different with autistic adults and adults with borderline personality disorder. But on the surface, they can look a lot alike if you just take a snapshot. And then some people have both diagnoses because there was a lot of relational trauma that maybe caused them to develop the borderline traits. So
I'm
yeah.
thinking in terms of overlaps too between
Mhm.
autism and borderline personality disorder is that theory of mind is not very well developed in either
Mhm.
condition, right? And
Mhm.
for different reasons. For autistics, it
Yeah.
is neurodevelopmental that the parts of your brain that have theory of mind don't work the same way. You have to learn it a different route. Hopefully, you have support developing theory of mind, and then you can
Yeah.
have a very robust theory of mind. Again, it just goes through that different route.
Mhm.
For people with borderline personality disorder, I see a need to strengthen their theory of mind as well. So, by theory of mind, I
Mhm.
kind of mean empathy, but I mean the ability to do it mentally, right? Not just
Yeah.
emotionally, that you're feeling what someone else is feeling.
Mhm.
And like you were saying, people who are autistic can be very empathic, especially women, in that way.
Mhm.
But the ability to think about it from the other person's perspective, more from
Yeah.
a logical place, right?
Mhm.
And
Cognitive
so,
empathy. I think
right,
they
right,
call that
cognitive empathy.
cognitive empathy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so with borderline personality disorder, rejection sensitivity is a big
Mhm.
problem, right? And I
Mhm.
wrote a thread on rejection sensitive dysphoria. It can be a component of ADHD, borderline. It can
Mhm.
it can be an experience that
Yeah.
many people have in different contexts, and it can
Mhm.
range in severity and frequency. But with
Mhm.
borderline personality disorder, there is a incredible sensitivity to real or perceived rejection or abandonment of any
Mhm.
kind, and then there are
Yeah.
maladaptive behaviors in reaction to that rejection sensitive dysphoria. And
Yeah.
theory of mind is something that can really help with rejection sensitivity, because a
Mhm.
lack of theory of mind is going to interpret things in your negative automatic ways, which is, it must be my
Mhm.
fault. It's because I'm
Mhm.
bad and unlovable in all of these ways,
Mhm.
and it can really help to have a few alternative explanations in your pocket, like,
Yeah.
maybe he didn't call me back because he's busy. Maybe
Yeah.
she ended the conversation because she had to go to the bathroom. I mean, there are so
Right.
many reasons that
Yeah.
uh, that someone can do something that we perceive as rejection or abandonment. And while
Mhm.
it's true, especially if you have an untreated mental health problem and you have some maladaptive behaviors, it is true that you might actually be engaging in some behaviors that are alienating other people. But it's
Yeah.
also likely that you're overreacting, right? And that there are
Mhm.
some different ways of coping. And even
Yeah.
if it is a real rejection, um,
Mhm.
you might be perceiving it more intensely, and having a more robust theory of mind, even in this situation where the rejection is real, can still help you come up with better ways to deal with the rejection. Like knowing
Yeah.
when it's appropriate to say, hey, I'm sorry, was that joke too much earlier, rather than just
Yeah.
cutting off the relationship entirely.
Yeah.
So, that's where something like mentalizing therapy can really help.
Mhm. Mhm. Exactly.
Can we talk
Yeah.
about OCD though?
Sure.
Because you've mentioned the rigid black and white thinking that autistic people are vulnerable
Mhm.
to. Um, what are your thoughts and observations about the prevalence of obsessive compulsive disorder in people who are autistic?
Um, I see it being highly prevalent. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head. And my thoughts are, I mean, I imagine there's something to do with the neurology, the brain wiring that's similar. Um, and the tendency to get like cognitively stuck on things. The tendency to have a hypersensitive uh feeling of like danger and threat that leads to a lot of anxiety, and the OCD rituals and behaviors and thoughts might help relieve some of that anxiety. One thing that people sometimes mix up is the repetitive behaviors of autistic people tend to be comforting and soothing, whereas and they're not done in so much distress always. Whereas in OCD, it's my understanding that the repetitive behaviors kind of cause more distress. They're not as regulating, even though the person thinks that they're going to be regulated by them. But autistic people are truly regulated by their repetitive behaviors. Um, so yeah, that's what I think about OCD and autism together.
That's an interesting
I don't see a
distinction.
lot of
Thank.
OCD in my practice, though.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a
Yeah.
lot of experience working with OCD either, and I don't have training in, for instance, exposure and response prevention therapy, which is one of the
Yeah.
main treatments used for it.
Mhm.
But you talk about the repetitive behaviors, right? And I'm
Mhm.
thinking of where those behaviors are coming from. So for someone who has autism without OCD, they
Mhm.
might spin in a circle 5 times before they sit down, but it's more about
Mhm.
that proprioceptive vestibular experience. It's about sense on a sensory level what's happening in their body and nervous
Mhm.
system.
Yeah.
Whereas a person with OCD might engage in that same ritual, might spin around 5 times before sitting down, but it's because there is basically a delusional type of thinking that I have to
Yeah.
engage in this ritual in order to prevent my mother from getting sick, right? And they might be
Exactly.
fully aware. They're like, I know this is delusional. I feel like I'm
Yeah.
crazy, but I just have to do this or else I have this irrational fear that my mom's going to get sick.
Yeah.
Or they could be on the lower insight end of the OCD spectrum and,
Mhm.
not have very much insight about
Mhm.
how illogical that is.
Yeah.
Um, but there
Exactly.
is, there is that rigidity, that black and white thinking that are more like uh on the spectrum of OCD traits, not necessarily always
Mhm.
qualifying. But then let's
Mhm.
get into um the comorbidity with a real or self-diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Kids who are
Mm.
autistic, diagnosed or not, who think of themselves as trans, non binary, some other gender identity. What
Mhm.
have you been seeing lately around that? Because I know you work with parents and you've had
Yeah.
a lot of parents coming to you saying that their autistic kids are now identifying as something other than their birth sex.
Yeah. Um, I think that there are several reasons for this phenomenon, and many of them are very real because autistic people tend to be socially non-conforming, and that includes gender. So, how they dress, how they act, their interests might be further away from the typical stereotypes that we think of with different sexes. I like to use sex. Gender is like it's so confusing to me. I'm just like what are we even talking about? So they might not identify as much with the stereotypes of their sex, what they see others in the world looking like and doing. And that can lead them to kind of feel like distant from that sex. Like, huh, I don't belong with them. And also, there can be the black and white thinking with if women or girls act like that and I don't, then maybe I'm not a girl or a woman. So there's that cognitive rigidity that isn't expanding like a woman and girl can be anything they want. A woman and girl is a, human female, right? And so I think that that might be part of it. Another part of it is autistic people have interoceptive differences. And that is where you don't feel as connected to the physical body. Like you literally don't feel the sensations of hunger as much. You might not feel the sensations of needing to go to the bathroom. Your perception of heat and cold and pain might be different. This is very common in autistic people. So when we have that kind of body disconnection, we know that that's part of gender dysphoria is feeling like a distance from your body, your sexed body. And another layer is there's a lot of time spent online. And we know that right now, online, the popular crowd, if you will, they are calling themselves trans and non binary. And often, autistic people who feel they don't belong in their sex based group might feel kind of drawn to this group of non conforming people. And then they say, like, oh, you're welcome here, you belong here. And autistic people tend to dress differently and stuff. So they can start to think of themselves as like, oh, maybe I'm non-binary. I don't dress like those women over there. So I think that there's like social aspects and then there's real like physical neurological aspects to it.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. If you like what you're hearing, now's a great time to like, subscribe, follow, rate, review, or share. You can also support the podcast by visiting sometherapist.com/shop, where you will find goods and services I have personally curated to support your well-being and enrich your life. We're just building the shop, so check back periodically and feel free to suggest recommendations. All right, now back to the show.
That message that says that there's one way to be a girl or a woman is just so sexist, and I don't feel like that's being talked about enough. Um, but yes, so if you think that there's one way to be a girl or a woman and you don't jive with the way they look and act and are, then yeah, you're going to want to opt out. You're going to de-identify with being a girl or a woman. Um, so, you know, some people might ask, well, what's the harm in that? And we know that there can be harm in that if it starts to lead down a medical path. And autistic people tend to struggle with like a sense of self, like an actual true identity, like this is who I am, similar to borderline personality disorder. Um, it's thought to be because they spend so much of their life masking and pretending to be someone else to fit in that they lose touch with who they are. And so when you grasp on to these other identities, these like trans or non-binary, I don't know, I just see it as another way of trying to figure out who you are. And if as long as that doesn't have serious repercussions for your life, then maybe it's safe, but we know that it's not that way.
I
So,
want to play devil's advocate for a moment with you with
mhm,
the concept of identity. Um,
mhm,
not in general. I mean, identity is a
mhm,
real thing, and then
mhm.
there are the narratives we have about identity right now. But I
Yeah.
think that's something that's maybe making our collective discourse around this worse is the kind of unspoken expectation that you're supposed to have an identity right from the
Mhm.
get go.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, my identity is hard won. And
Mhm.
like it and I think anyone like if you look at the most fascinating people in the world, like I would hazard a guess that most of them like struggled to develop an identity through adversity that built character.
Yeah.
And I think it's very anxiety provoking as a young person to have this expectation that you should know who you are, whatever that even
Yeah.
means, right? That you should
Yeah.
have a solid sense of identity, self worth, self esteem, any of that. Now, I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't because life's
Mhm.
hard without one, but I also feel like, building a character, building a personality and identity to whatever degree you consider these synonymous or not, like those are lifelong processes, you know? And a lot of
Yeah.
that stuff doesn't even start to solidify until you hit 30. And
Mhm.
like, I feel like we need to somehow make it okay for young people to struggle with this stuff in a healthy
Mhm.
way, to struggle
Yeah.
without jumping to foregone conclusions, without
Mm.
pinning themselves into a box of identity prematurely. And also without despairing over their lack of identity. There needs to be some middle ground where it's like, you know what, I'm just 18. Like, I'm
Yeah.
sure I'm going to be different in 10 years. And right now, I just
Mhm.
want an employer to think that I am capable of like serving coffee, you know?
Right?
Like,
Yeah. I know you're playing devil's advocate, but I actually agree with you. That yes, we know from our fields of child psychology, child development, that identity formation is a lifelong process. And in adolescence, it's supposed to be fluid. That is the task of adolescence is going through all of that. You're not supposed to be cemented into an identity box. Um, but with regard to autistic people, I think that even as an adult, they can struggle with feeling connected to like, who am I? There's just like this lack of groundedness in, and I mean identity in the old way that we used to use identity. So there's just kind of they tend to especially the girls kind of go with the crowd a bit, like easily influenced, which is a high risk for assault and victimization, because there can be just like a lack of being tethered to something that can make you kind of get into more high risk situations. And so that's what I mean with lack of identity that can kind of influence them to want to grasp onto this trans identity, to belong somewhere. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a lifelong process. I wish that we would stop being so identity obsessed. And I think that the adults have kind of done this to the kids. I think we've introduced it to them in a lot of ways. Yeah.
There was this thing that happened at my stepkids' school where they were supposed to bring they were given like a brown paper lunch bag empty with a
Hmm.
little note stapled to it saying, fill this bag with things that represent your identity. And really, what it was a
Okay.
show and tell. It was like, bring things from
Hmm.
home so we can learn about you. And, whether
Right.
it's like you bring a spoon because your mom loves cooking Persian food or whatever. And like,
Right.
it's just like bring your toy soccer ball because you like soccer. And I was just thinking, like, why identity? That is such a heavy
I
abstract
know.
concept for these kids. Like, just
I
bring us something from
know.
home to tell us about what you like to do in your free time or what your family's into or whatever. That would be fine. That would be fine. That's
Yeah.
all. That's all it needs to be.
They probably use that word because it's popular and they wanted to show that they're progressive or something. But I agree, this like identity focus, it's too much. We earn our identities. And like you said, like you went through a lot to be who you are now. And I'm the same. The only identity I really grasp onto is like, I'm a mother. And I went through hell to become a mother, which is why the identity feels so strong for me. But these kids, I just feel like they're putting their attention and their energy in the wrong place. But I think that's just what kids do. They do things that the adults don't really agree with. It's just today they have such larger consequences, greater consequences.
Yeah, and I worry about those consequences, especially when it comes to concretizing whatever feeble sense of identity you've eked out at the age of 10 or 15 or whatever. I mean, I
Yeah.
think about like,
Yeah.
because at that age you can have an oppositional personality, right? And then
Hmm.
what? You're going to get
Yeah.
pigeonholed as being the person who always says no to whatever everyone else is saying yes to. Well, that's reactive.
Yeah.
What if everyone
Hmm.
else is right and you're wrong and you just became the boy who cried wolf because nobody's going to believe you because you're just reacting that way by default. Well, it takes
Yeah.
a long time for people with an oppositional streak as I personally have. you know,
Hmm.
like it takes a long time when you're somebody who has some opposition in your temperament to discover what's worth fighting for, what's worth
Yes.
disagreeing over, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
what's not.
Yep.
That's not something you want to be pigeonholed into. Same thing with the opposite,
Right.
being agreeable. Like, do you want to be the nice
Hmm.
person? Are you sure that you want to commit to being the nice person? Because nice girls
Yeah.
get trampled on,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
there are just so many things about the fragility of the budding development of identity early in life
Hmm.
that it's like you do not want to get locked into that. Like you really want
No.
some time to figure that out. And I
Yeah.
just wish that someone had told me when I was, 18 or 20, like, don't worry, everybody knows you're young. Nobody expects you to have much of a personality yet. Just try to learn the
Hmm.
rules and do a good job and, make some money and like
Yeah. Live
get
your
stable. Like,
life.
that's all you got to do, you'll figure it out
Yeah.
later.
Yeah. Live your life. Travel, explore, try on different, identities. That's part of being young is learning about yourself. It's such a beautiful process. I feel so bad that these kids are so focused on putting themselves in a box. Um, and
And I think
also
you
yeah.
well, I think you learn best about yourself by forgetting yourself. Like, get interested in the
Mhm.
world, you know? That's what makes you
Exactly.
interesting is when you're interested in other people, things going on.
Mhm. Get
What were you gonna say?
outside of yourself. And
Yeah.
that builds mental health as well, is to stop focusing so inward. We need to focus outward as well to be well.
So I feel like we're delivering a lot of value to our audience. And just to really pack a punch, I'm curious, what would you say to a parent coming to you saying, I believe my daughter's autistic, and now she's gone down this rabbit hole. She thinks she's trans, and she's pushing and screaming for us to affirm, for us to use this name and pronouns. She wants us to take her to the endocrinologist. She wants to start hormones. She wants a binder. She won't listen to anything we have to say. She's very rigid. She just, screams and storms out of the rooms and calls us names. And they
Mhm.
think that her autism is playing a role in this. What words
Mhm.
of wisdom would you have to offer them?
Mm. Oh, first, I would take a deep breath because it's not an easy space to be in because of the rigidity. Words of wisdom, I would probably tell those parents to be a little bit matter of fact about it all and not to come down heavy contradicting their daughter. So there's like, two polarities, immediately affirm and then also, contradict what they're saying when they claim to be trans or a boy or whatever. I don't I don't recommend either of those. I think that just kind of being in this middle space in order to try to reduce the likelihood that the kids are going to like dig their heels in. Because the more we push, depending on their developmental stage, the more they're going to push back and really dig their heels into this new identity. So what I would do is I would probably take a few deep breaths. I would look for support for myself. And then I would probably look for maybe an exploratory therapist for my child. And I would try to just keep the bigger picture, slow down, don't participate in this urgency culture, and try to stay connected to your child. That's really important. So we don't want to risk damaging that relationship, and we can do that in a wise way without immediately affirming or contradicting. Yeah, that's what I would say. It's happening a lot now. Hmm.
Okay, thank you. So,
Yeah,
tell people where they can find you. I think you have an Instagram presence, you have a blog, you offer parent coaching and consultation.
I do. They can find me at tevajohnstone.com. That's my website. They can find me on Instagram at neurocurious therapist. And then on Substack, I have a Substack called Wrong Think, and it's teva.substack.com. Yeah, they can come hang out on any of those platforms.
And so, any parents listening to this who want to talk to you, they can find out more about coaching and consultation at tevajohnstone.com.
Yes, exactly. They can contact me through there, and it's all explained about what that even is, coaching and consultation, on the website.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast with Stephanie Wynn, LMFT. This podcast is produced by Eric and Amber Beals at Different Mix. Special thanks to the talented musician Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. At sometherapist.com, you can find more information on any topic, guest, resource, product, or service you've heard of here today. You can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you would like to ask a question, suggest a topic, be a guest, or invite me to speak, you can email us at hello@sometherapist.com. You can also send us a voice memo with your question, and we just might play it. Of course, just because I'm some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.